Um, yes, thank you guys. Let me put my little timer on here because I want to make sure I stay to my time here. My name is Vanessa Tovis. By trade, I am a Microsoft 365 solutions architect. And all that means is I've been working with Microsoft technology since the very first versions of SharePoint on-prem, right? SQL Server, Microsoft's BI suite, and my career paralleled uh, right along with Microsoft as their platform matured and went into and built the cloud and went into the cloud. And so I've brought many customers into 365 and the hundreds of thousands of employees that follow them, and have really focused on the latter part of several years around solutions architecture. And that really just means you have a fundamental understanding of where things kind of don't fit necessarily in 365, and you become a master of being creative in many ways. But it also means that you have an understanding of really how well Microsoft 365 uh, can play a part of an organization's management of information. And about 5 years ago, I went to work for a company called Druva. Druva is based in Santa Clara, but also in Pune. And we're at first and foremost a data protection company, but really is an example kind of a split in the direction that many data protection companies started. Druva started our understanding of what resilience looks like and is needed about 6 years ago in its architecture, and really moved beyond the concept of a backup, right? And this topic, because it marries both my knowledge and experience with the Microsoft ecosystem and my understanding in the world of cyber incident response and cyber resiliency, is I'm hoping that you come away with more of an understanding, come away with more questions to pose back to your team. And this very specific topic I presented at Microsoft Ignite in last year in November, and it was a great audience. It was probably the largest audience I've spoken to, almost 400 people. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to really just touch on, is a number of things, but right, the ecosystem being under attack, the differences in two classes of backup vendors. And I think that becomes super critical for you to understand that when I talk about a backup vendor, I'm not talking about just backup, and we'll touch on that. Cyber incident response and collaboration, and then what AI has done to this concept of what it means to be resilient, right? To be prepared for a resilient stance, right? These are these obstacles that I just have here. They're so high level. But when we think about these attackers and who's coming after our data, right? Who's coming after disruption? Who's coming after money? They're not going away. In fact, they have built an economy of that rivals probably many countries in terms of how they organized, right? You have very specific threat actors that do one thing, and they do it so well in their space, and they have learned how to monetize disruption and this criminal activity. We'll touch on human engineers, and I'm not talking necessarily just our engineers as a company, but the engineers that build this platform. The reality is we are all human, and no one intentionally decides to roll out a vulnerability but that happens. And so we'll touch on that. The data loss gaps in the platform. SharePoint was not architected for cyber attacks. It was not architected for cyber resilience. It was architected with very specific use cases in mind in the on-prem world where it started. And as it migrated and moved, and many of these platforms that we have, many of these applications that we have, their architecture is about collaboration, or it's about email, or it's about files, or it's about, communication. It wasn't, many of these things did not have some feature requests that really touched on a cyber resilience. So there's data loss gaps that are naturally in the platform. I mean, the recycle bin has a very specific place, right? Preservation hold library and retention policy have a very specific place. Legal hold has very specific features, but they're not architected to deal with the recovery of data in case of a ransomware attack. And users, of course, and admins, we have access to things. And for users for many years, it doesn't matter when a company went and transitioned into the cloud and the user didn't understand, that they were now in 365, they still did the same thing. They see a button and they do it. If they can do it, they will do it. So many of the tickets that you find in your ticketing systems today are just about the fact that you have a user who has the ability to do something and they do it because, some people are more curious than others. And also in that, they don't understand that the move function itself is not a migration tool. And that button that they pressed they didn't understand that underneath there were 27,000 files and 4,000 folders nested all throughout. And that the move function, even though it has better guardrails today, is not intended to do that, right? So all of these things, we as an organization that, as any one of you that are owners of your Azure world, your Microsoft 365 world, you're facing all of these things all at once, right? And you only have to kind of begin to look at, in every statistic, I think there's every one but one that I mentioned in here, that you see, or every graph in here is coming from Microsoft. So I don't have to make up any statistics. I don't have to make up a story about the impact of this storm 0501 and its pattern of what it's doing and how it is now, this is the pattern, this is what's on trend, a hybrid attack. And this hybrid attack, what's really interesting about, I don't want to say interesting as in yay, good type of thing, but this was reported by Microsoft in September of 2024. It's still active today, but in the last 30 to 40 conferences I've presented at, and I've asked people if they have ever heard of this, and the response usually is pretty low. It's maybe one or two people, if that. So we have so much information that's being provided to us from Microsoft about what these attackers are doing, the patterns of their attack. In this case, you have a hybrid attack that didn't start with malware at the endpoint. It started in the middle from a compromised credential, right? And that compromised credential, based upon what Microsoft is also saying, you have about an hour and 42 minutes before the traverse begins. But that's just Microsoft. You have other organizations like CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike just released their 2025 report on that same type of thing. And what they're saying is that you have under 30 minutes before, 30 minutes from the point of an attacker coming in to the point that they've scanned your network, right? So they understand and they know what they're dealing with. That doesn't imply that they're going to do anything. That could imply it's part of their reconnaissance, right? Part of their planning. These criminals don't just literally get a credential and just start going. There's a lot of work that's done, just as much work as you guys are doing to learn how to defend, how to configure, how to use any of these awesome features. Whether we're utilizing Defender or we're utilizing, Purview, that much effort, if not more, is going into what criminals are doing to attack you. And this footprint of what we're looking at is that once they traverse, they're going after cloud data. So that's your Microsoft 365 of the world, the OneDrive data, the email data, even SharePoint, right? And then they're going back to the endpoint, laptop, desktop. That's where the user footprint, right? My footprint of data in my organization resides on my laptop. That's what I use. Resides in my OneDrive and my email. Those are the core things where I'm saving some information, plus wherever I'm collaborating. So when we see these criminals coming in, this is their pattern, this is the trend, and this trend is still holding true, right? Hybrid attacks, compromise of credential, not necessarily from malware. And what we're doing, they're looking for sensitive data. Well, they're looking for data, then looking for sensitive data, reading that data, exfiltrating that data, encrypting that data, and then leaving you with a ransom. So we're going to talk really about the presence of sensitive data and where it is, right? So when we talk about the engineering of Microsoft and the human element, and I don't care if, like even if some aspect of Microsoft's code is also being redone by, some AI code tool, the ability for a vendor that owns something, a SaaS platform like this, to introduce a vulnerability is high. I mean, it happens. It is not intentional. So if you're not, as part of your role, right, not everyone in the collaborative space, or even in the Entra space or an identity space, not everyone reads CISA, right? Like goes to CISA or gets any of these alerts. You have maybe your security team doing that. But if you were to understand like how this works, is that you're going to get a vulnerability report or something that says, hey, the Microsoft Partner Center improper access control vulnerability. And no, for me, when I read that, I was like, the Partner Center, that's strange, because you have to look at the entire architecture of that particular thing and knowing what the Partner Center is built on and what technologies it uses from its architecture, its own, where it stores its data, right? Fundamentally, it's the same thing as all the all the portals that you have under the Dynamics world. Dynamics has such an amazing spread and reach in how people configure it. So when you talk about when they're saying this, I was like, no, that can't just be that. So when you keep digging sometimes into these vulnerabilities, you end up coming back to the Microsoft, right, report, and you're like, oh, you know what? It wasn't in that. It wasn't in the Partner Center. It was with Power Apps. The vulnerability that was introduced was with Power Apps, and that's a different conversation. And so we need to really, it's so hard now when you're an admin, anyone that is an admin for any kind of cloud SaaS platform, whether it's ServiceNow or any one of these SaaS applications that are out there, you now have to elevate your understanding of security, because someone needs to have eyes on and look at things. I'm not saying you need to be a cloud security architect, but you definitely need to elevate and understand and know exactly what these vulnerabilities, right? This vulnerability, it was reported as critical and it was reported as exploited. That means someone accessed something that they shouldn't have on the other end. Right? Human element is important. to understand. And we'll talk more about the role about vendors as well, and especially around AI. Now let's talk about from a cyber perspective, a cybersecurity perspective. Let's say I had an attack. The first thing, if we're lucky, okay, if we're lucky that the Microsoft ecosystem is under the purview of the security team, the cybersecurity team. I like to assume that it is, and it's probably getting better. But this is part of what we also have to understand about our own environments, is that attached to every license we have is our logs. They're the logs about activity. And when you're trying to prove or disprove something, you need these logs. The team, the analysis team, the incident response team needs this log, whether they realize it or not. So it's very much so associated with the type of license that you have that determines what you have and for how long that data, this log data, will be kept around. So when we're talking about, I go and I present at these conferences here in the US called B-Sides. They are regional security conferences, similar to Microsoft community ones, but they're really centric to all about security, both physical security, network security, cybersecurity, right? And in there, the number that they're talking about is generally 120 days. That is how long a criminal is inside an environment before they're generally detected. 120 days. So that means they could have been doing so much reconnaissance. That doesn't mean that they've been active, but they could have been in there. And so if they've been in there that long, and if they have been making these small little iterative changes that Microsoft is talking about too, right, to stay under the radar, that means that most of these logs and the data about that time from when they started would have purged. Right? So in our roles, we have to, one, understand exactly what logs we have, two, ask and ensure that there's visibility to this log data, and whether our organization is using something like Microsoft Sentinel and ingesting these logs so that we maintain this data, right? It's important to understand why these logs play such a part, because, like I said, they're either going to prove or disprove activity. And if in a cyber incident response, right, that's what we're trying to figure out. Now, there's a report called the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. It is released every year in October, usually towards the end. And last year, I think, was the 5th or 6th year of the report. So this report is super critical because it also gives you so it's like 50% marketing, 50% all the statistics, right? So what that means is it just is super pretty. It's like very nice. But it has some very important information. But the other part about this information isn't just what you see in the current year's report, but it's a shift from the prior year. And so many of these statistics are they just stay on an upward trend. So I'll talk about the importance of encryptions and exfiltration. And we'll touch on that too in a little bit. The first time it was reported, this pairing of encryptions and exfiltration, it was 16%. Then it went to 23%. And in 2025 report, right, which is everything that's red. Everything that's red. I crossed out things that are from 2024. I kept the same slide from the year before because it's the same stuff that's happening, just more. Right? Exfiltration is on the rise, just straight up exfiltration. And we'll talk about that. Human operated use of remote encryption. There was an admin who wanted to, he was an admin like anyone else. He wanted to try and see if you could remote encrypt a OneDrive. And he went about it, trying to figure it out. And once he was able to do it, it's not like he went and reported all of his findings to that, Microsoft bounty process in their system about finding bugs. He posted a blog about it. And this is where we have to realize too, is that some of these things are not even introduced by criminals. They can just by the nature of how our products are architected and the features in which, what their purpose, they have capabilities that it just takes the right person to find these holes, right? And then of course, the increase in hybrid attack, right? That's that same thing I just mentioned about the Storm 0501 footprint. The other thing that's important to understand, and that it becomes super important, is the role of for the reported attacks. You had an increase for these successful identity attacks, right? It was 42% the year before that were based upon identity attacks. Those are what most people would consider compromised credential. And that went up, and that shot up to about 80% as per the 2025 report. And that's because now you're not just dealing with a compromise of credential, right? You're also dealing with an architecture of tokens, refresh token. So many vendors and so many users, we work and live within the confines of what Microsoft provides us. And what they're providing, an engineer, you only have to look at your own machines, your own laptops, to understand that when you go into Microsoft 365 and if you just log in, you've authenticated, there's a token, and on that token, there's an expiration date. And that expiration date isn't always, 24 hours, that type of thing. A lot of it depends so much on your configuration and how you're doing it, whether or not you also use Okta or something like Okta. So here we have this rise of the token. And there's two types of tokens that they're real two utilizations of tokens that are important to understand. One that comes through SaaS vendors, right? That's like how Druva communicates with Microsoft 365 with the Graph API and that. So it's SaaS to SaaS. And the other one is at the hands of the user, you and I, every one of us, in our own little devices. And this is also why offboarding, and I wish I would have put this slide in here, but offboarding has to go beyond marking and blocking a user as no longer being able to sign in. That's just one thing, the first thing. That means a user can't sign in. There's like 4 other things that in many of the offboardings that I've recommended from an automation perspective, right? You have to revoke the user tokens. You have to revoke all the sessions of that user. And the reason why is because these tokens, like I said, have expiration dates, and you might, as a user, have blocked that. You block that user from physically signing in. So that user can't go through the MF, even if they had their MFA, they couldn't do it. But these tokens can still have access. And if a user also is on the other side on their laptop or their desktop at home, and they've authenticated, right? They have this access token, and the expiration date hasn't passed. There's no challenge for that. There's no re-authentication of a token unless the expiration happens, or unless you, as an organization, adopt some more deeper principles to how you offboard any of these 365, any user that is an Entra ID. Right? So the rise of identity attacks has now expanded beyond just that of a compromise of a credential. Now, in a cyber incident response, and I don't know, right? So every organization is different. You can have the same company of the same size and make the same revenue, but how formal they are and how they've invested in their own cyber incident response, it can vary widely. In every response, you generally have a cyber incident response team, but you really more so have roles and functions. And every one of these roles has different questions that they are asking, that they require. They need different evidence to do and fulfill their part of an incident response, right? Especially one that is an active attack or an attack that they're trying to kind of do some analysis on, they've recovered. So this is also where we fall apart. We begin to fall apart because organizations for many years, even before the world of SaaS, you had your data loss prevention teams, your data, right, in like for your physical infrastructure, and they would have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, what databases needed to be up, what servers, and then it went to VMs, right? So they're very formal in the attention that they provided to that. But once we went into the cloud, not only were we kind of negligent in giving up many of these controls and understanding of how we're going to get this data back, how are we going to get Microsoft's data back, right? It didn't change in its architecture. It just literally moved to a physically a different location managed by Microsoft's world. And I'm not here to I'm not taking a dig at Microsoft. I love this platform. This is why I talk about this. But we have to be honest and in understanding truly how did this happen and what we need to do in this. So as part of a cyber incident response, we need to absolutely not just know who is supposed to be doing what, but we need to even do better collaboration, have better collaboration across the board. It's when we, from a truer perspective, right, when we work with customers, and as customers come to us, generally the first point of contact that we have is a backup admin, the team that manages all the backups. And with that, you have a person that is looking at backup requirements, all right? They have retention policies that they have to adhere to. And but if an organization only, and if they just stop there, what they're doing is they're missing out on understanding the importance of planning for resilience, right? In the world of what we are using Purview, we are using Microsoft Defender, whether it's Office 365 Defender or Endpoint Defender, whatever we're using, whatever Defender licenses we're using. And those are defensive mechanisms. And at some point, we also have to plan for our resilience, right? So as when you find and you're hearing things like an hour and 42 minutes, or, from Microsoft saying before the traverse begins, when CrowdStrike is turning around and telling us that the network scanning is completed within under 30 minutes, the defense is a super hard game right now. And it's a very different game. It's a very different set of plans, different tools, different investment altogether. Resilience, in the light of what is happening, right? In the fact that we're just constantly in a defensive mode, you have to be offensive in your plan to be resilient. That sounds crazy, but that means we need to not wait until we are in the middle of an attack to have understood where the sensitive data is, where the solutions are. As part of a recovery plan, a resilience plan, we have to take a different approach to even how we are looking at our recovery mechanism, right? What that means is I'll get called in once in a while to into a customer call, and I always seem to be the one that has to answer this question. How fast can it be for you to recover all of our data? And unfortunately have to say, that is not the right question to be asking now, right? That's not. Because what that tells me is that do you have an understanding of what solutions your architects, we'll just talk Microsoft, right? What solutions your architects have built, what time sensitive solutions they have, what processes, operational processes are in these environments. Not everything is equal in this world that we have built underneath Microsoft 365, right? Not every Azure VM is of equal importance. I'm saying goodbye to saying hello to my daughter. Not everything is of equal importance. And I'm not saying not every database is of equal importance, but remember that process that we used to take when we sat back and said, if our systems, our network went down, what was the most important thing for us to bring up? So we have to take and do a better job of planning to be resilient, not just from a simple perspective of like, what do I have back? What am I backing up? But how am I going to approach that backup? And that will come with better collaboration and understanding of what logs do you have? Identity team, whoever manages the Entra side, are you collaborating with your security team? If that security team is also a third-party external team, we need to do a better job at that. We need to ask these questions before they're needed. We need to understand who are the AI developers that are building on, whether it's Copilot or if you guys are utilizing anything else outside of the Microsoft world. But now the simple step that we have as any organization that we have taken on stepping towards any AI, anything, doesn't matter what we're doing, right? We have to now, we have introduced additional threat vectors just by the nature of that. And I'm not just talking about the issues that occurred early on about exposing certain data to different people, right, that never should have seen it. That's a different issue. That's a governance issue. I'm talking about the simple fact of that I am now an engineer, or I don't even have to be an engineer. I could be a power user, and I got a license to go build something in Copilot Studio. And now I begin to hook data into this little world, and it could absolutely be needed. And I'm not saying it's not needed or not beneficial, but we cannot go blindly now with just the fact that we are learning that a tool itself cannot dictate what an organization is going to face, right? You will face this. The nature of having an individual that has access to information in order to consume that information and build data connections into that information on a laptop or even on a VM where I'm developing. Now I have access. So now here I'm a person that never had this access before, and I might have this access because I need it to build something, to consume all of this data in this one SharePoint site. But so now I've elevated every data source that is consumed via my Copilot. But do I know how in the hell do I even know what I've done? Right? Have I communicated? Has the security team communicated with me about a place where I'm supposed to report every single data source that I'm now exposing in here, that I'm now consuming, utilizing as a knowledge source? Because now that team has to communicate with this backup team to say, hey, now we have we have a customer facing bot that now is looking at everything, whatever it's going to look at. That's looking at 2 data sources. What's our RTO? Right? Or what's another one? Mean time to recover on these systems. And this is like what I'm talking about. We can no longer just literally talk about a tool and the threats that we're facing with these tools. Because prior to AI, right, the world of AI, we already had enough to deal with in this, whether the attack was endpoint to cloud, cloud to cloud, cloud to endpoint. It's one of the reasons why I wholeheartedly believe that you have to even take a good look at even the account creation of these administrative accounts, but to stop exposure back to a local network. The account shouldn't exist on a local network. As an example, an admin account that manages the SaaS world. And in many cases, people ran and run an Active Directory. And one of their first things to do is they go create an account. And that account now gets synced. And is that the right thing? I can challenge you as to why you should have admin accounts only be created in the SaaS application, right? In Entra ID, because then I don't have a backwards exposure. Why? Why would I have backwards exposure? Because on so many things in the world of Windows servers, or things that can be accessed via my laptop, you have this all users, right? All authenticated users access. And if that's the case, I'm not traversing back. So these attacks that we're facing, now we have to deal with things like our federated trusts and right account synchronization for 365. Admin accounts, they're still when I went to work for a company and I did an audit, and in that audit I was like, you have way too many admins for the world of Azure for 365. You have too many global admins. And, most of these haven't logged in with their global admin accounts. And a couple of these at that time, they weren't even using MFA. I'm like, good Lord. It is just, they're just waiting to be attacked, waiting to be compromised. And now in this world, right? So SSO, we have to think too about things. SSO came about and solved one big problem for an organization when it first started. And that was getting rid of the biggest help desk ticket issue, which is resetting of a password. I mean, that's the most beautiful problem it solved for a network admin back in the day, right? So became a thing. But now that we utilize it, it is now also the center of the world of SaaS applications as well. And that means the exposure for that account not only exposes other systems, but the data. Right? Because of this type of architecture, you have things like Siemens had deletions of devices, right? ServiceNow had exfiltrations. Backup companies in 2022 or 2023, there was a stat on the Microsoft Digital Defense Report that was like 99% attempt to attack the backups. 99%. On every attack that occurred, these attackers went after the backups. That's easy to understand. They needed to cut the legs out from any kind of resilience, any kind of response, any type of thing that would make their ransom attack, right? Their ransom note even more impactful. So this world that we have, by all means, is exposed. And then with AI, these additional data sources, we have to plan for that. We have to plan to ensure if you're going to hook all of these knowledge sources, wherever they are, be it in SharePoint, a database, a SaaS application, doesn't matter where it is, and bring that in, you also have to ensure that not only is your code safe, but that the data, when you go to recover, when you recover from a cyber incident, that your data is actually there too. What value is any and all of these things that we're building if the underlying data is not protected? Now comes the thing that most people aren't even thinking about, which is these plugins. These are third-party plugins right? These third-party plugins into things like the catalog and I think it's Foundry, like for Copilot for development. I can drop in these plugins and I can use all of these things from a third-party vendor. And I don't know if any of you guys remember SolarWinds. And SolarWinds had it was one of the biggest worldwide vulnerabilities and access to information that came through this trusted vendor, right? Government entities, financial, insurance, hospitals, all of them, everyone that used them. And because of that, we now really need to elevate our third-party vendors, even Druva, okay? We are a third-party vendor that accesses your data. So you can't just look at Microsoft and what they give you and some, and the tools of Copilot and realize that that's done in silo. That you have to understand the operational practices of what you're using. That your AI, now, if I'm using this plugin and that vendor, and I have no idea who that is, no one else but that engineer who picked that plugin has any idea that there's even a third party being used. And here comes this vulnerability. No one has visibility to it, right? And what do we have when we are utilizing our Copilot? We are authenticated. So we have to know for every vendor, even let's just talk about the vendors that come into our Entra, right? That deploy an enterprise application, a service principal. There's so much scrutiny that goes into that. I'm telling you, there's so much scrutiny, and oftentimes I get asked to come in and really talk about both our architecture of our connection.
Hey, Vanessa, quick reminder, you have just 5 minutes left for the session. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. And we talk about operational practices of our organization, and that's what you need to elevate, right? You need to elevate these types of questions. You have to understand what these vendors are doing, what roles, what they have from a rollback perspective. I'm going to go jump through these last couple of slides. Spent way too much time on the front side, but that's okay. So when we talk about resilience, identity is the first thing that has to get validated and recovered before we recover data. All right. We have to say our Entra ID is good, which means if you cannot tell me what your conditional access policies look like last Thursday or last Monday, that means you have no idea what state to return to, or what state that your security teams is saying you need to return to. You have to protect the data. You have to be able to recover this data, because this data also in your Entra ID helps you to define and see patterns that go beyond what we look at, like the simple fact that we onboard and offboard we onboard on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Why did someone create an account on a Sunday? And you have to be able to look for those types of things, and you need data, historic data, to understand that. So you have to back up this data, right? For your data within 365, what we aren't looking at is we have so many alerts and so many alerting on like user behavior, right? Vanessa logged in from Australia. 5 minutes later, she logged in from Jacksonville, Florida, right? That's an impossible travel alert. So a lot of the alerting that we have is based upon user, when the user is, where they should be. But what we really don't have is the historic behavior of the data that we have today. And that's where you have the separation of data protection companies, right? The two different classes. So you have companies like Druva. Druva started this data anomaly detection because we back up data every day, which means we have the historic data and we understand metadata, we know size, we know all these things. And we built this large language model right around that to provide these alerts. And it's not even about utilizing these as signals for security. We have some customers that do that, but it's about understanding what was affected so that we can turn around and have a plan, a better plan of resilience. What site collections were affected? What site files were altered? What number of files in my Azure files were encrypted, right? Out of my 4 million files, what am I going to do? How do I recover that? Well, part of recovery and resiliency is understanding the historic data. The other thing that your data protection companies, especially when you deal with data anomalies, is that you're going to get file level understanding. It goes down to a file and you can't just recover in OneDrive and SharePoint. Because of version history, you have to remove that corruption, that alteration, and you have to prove that. So not only do I need to come in here and know which ones to clean, but I need to have and utilize this with PowerShell and only clean 500,000 of my 4 million files, then I can recover, right? And the last two slides I have are pretty straightforward. We talk about time-sensitive data. I mentioned this before. When you deal with a platform and Microsoft is saying that there's pairing of encryption and exfiltration, you have to know how that affects not just sensitive data, but time-sensitive data. Time-sensitive data is this. I'm an engineering company. We have a bid project. The bid is due next week. We've been working on this bid package for the last 2 months. The revenue from this would represent about 1/3 of our revenue for next year. I need to deliver that bid package on Monday. If I were attacked, and if we're so lucky, if we are lucky, if we did a good job, we planned it and we had a backup, the prior point of time has gaps of data loss, right? Because of also what Microsoft is talking about, how these encryptions are occurring. It's no longer like a big sledgehammer. These criminals are using AI as well. So they're making their targets a little bit smaller, more strategic. So you can no longer just use a prior point of time. What you have to do is you have to rebuild and look at a series of all of these snapshots that are there in your backup and build a snapshot that never existed of the last known good clean file. This is the difference. This is like part of resilience in the face of a cyber attack, is to understand what buttons you're going to press before you say things are good. And this is the last slide. I think I can hold off on this slide. So the last thing to talk about is sensitive data. In this world of sensitive data, and we look at what these criminals are doing. So first and foremost, they're going to our OneDrive, going to the cloud, they're going to endpoints. And on the endpoint, you have still users who should have sensitive data because that's what they do. They work on Excel files for the finance budget, right? They work on a legal contract. Absolutely, but they're there. Which means if you have no visibility, if you're not using Defender for Endpoint and pushing down and you don't have an E5 compliance, what you need to know is where is the sensitive data on these endpoints? And that's another thing, whether you're using the Defender for Endpoint, right, with the E5 compliance, or you're utilizing a backup, and your backup tools can tell you exactly where sensitive data resides. It's just what they do. That's like part of the architecture of this other class of backup company. And then you look at how AI itself has elevated the need to protect and understand everything that is on the endpoint and you have to back up this data for any AI developer, just merely because of what they have access to, right? All right, and I appreciate the time, and I think I'm right at my time right now. And here, let me end with. I do have a few more slides, but that's okay. I went too long in talking about.
Thank you, Vanessa, for this wonderful session. And thank you, everyone, for bringing so wonderful audience. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Vanessa, or you can post that in the chat.